So I almost feel like I should change my sermon text to Psalm 23. But look, I'm not going to. I'm going to go back to Hebrews chapter 11, which is what I've been preaching through and what I told you that I'm going to preach through a little bit. And we've been talking about faith. And I am going to do a little bit of review, especially since I was gone last week. But I really want to hammer this home. And I want to tell you that God is actually using this and using these sermons in my life personally as He's teaching me more about how to be a person of faith, how to be a man of faith. And you would think I would have that under control by now, right? I mean, seriously, but I'm telling you that God is still working on me as well. And He is teaching me about faith and about how to pray in faith and about how to believe in faith. And He's using these messages in these scriptures. So I just want to go over a few things. So, and if there's one thing I just want to keep hammering home, it is what true biblical faith really is. And I actually should have had them hide it from you and so you could tell me. But true biblical faith, you remember it's got three elements. It is hearing a word from God, it is believing God, and then it is acting upon what you heard. It's got to have all three of those. You cannot leave one of them out. Hearing from God, Romans 10:17 says that faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. So it's this hearing that begins to produce faith. You have got true biblical faith, and this is one of the things, this first part, I really, is critical. True biblical faith is not just you making a wish list and then believing it. True biblical faith is hearing from God. It is hearing a word from God and receiving a promise from God. Go ahead and go back to my slide, brother. That's the one we want to drive home. True biblical faith is based, that's why in that first verse he says faith is the substance of things hoped for. It is a foundation. It has a foundation, and that foundation is the Word of God. So the obvious question is, and I don't have an answer, so I probably shouldn't even ask the question. At least I don't have an answer for you this morning, well, how do I hear from God? Sometimes God has His written word. He speaks to us through that. Sometimes God just speaks to our hearts. He just lets us know. And you're like, how do I hear from God? And I'm going to explore that at some point, probably after this, because that's really a whole nother sermon series within itself. But here's one thing I can assure you of. When God speaks to you, you know it. I want you to know that. When God speaks to you, you know it, and you know it's Him. And you know what? You also know what He's saying. So let's try not to convolute the waters. Let's not make it any more difficult than it is. When God speaks to you, you'll know He's speaking to you. You'll know it's Him, and you'll know what He's saying to you. And so you need to hear that word, and then you need to believe that word. In fact, in Romans chapter 4, verse 3, Paul is using Abraham, who we're going to look at here in a minute, and it says that Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. God gave Abraham the promise. He said, you're going to be the father of a great nation. Your descendants are going to be like the stars in the sky, like the sand on the seashore on the beach. You are going to be the father of a great nation. He heard from God. God gave him a word, but then he believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. So we need to hear a word from God, and then we need to believe God, and then we need to act upon it. James chapter 2 verse 26 says that just like the body without the soul is dead without the spirit, for as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead. You get what he's saying there? Just like the body without the spirit, it's dead. Faith without works is dead. Listen, you cannot leave off number 3. If number 3 is not there, it's not true biblical faith. True biblical faith always has an action behind it. In fact, faith is a verb. It's not a noun. I guess it can be a noun, but faith is actually a verb. It requires action. What you do, if you've caught on to this by now, you can say it with me. What you do says more about what you believe than what you say. What you do says more about what you believe than what you say. True biblical faith is hearing from God, it's believing God, and then it is acting on it. And you can see in every one of these that we've already looked at or that we will look at, every one of them went through this process. They heard from God, they believed what they heard, and then they acted upon it. So one of the things that I started doing, and I actually started doing this a little bit late. You can give me the next slide. I was a week late when I caught on to what I was looking at here. We have seen what I'm calling the fuel for faith. And in each one of these people, there was something that's a comment that's made that was a fuel for their faith. It was a fuel that ignited their faith and that kept them moving forward in faith. I wasn't real clear because, like I said, I was a week late on this. I kind of tried to back up and do it. I wasn't real clear about it. But if you read the passage about Abel, we talked about Abel and how verse 4 says that he gave, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4 says that he gave to God a more excellent sacrifice through which he obtained witness that he was righteous. I remember we made the distinction. The fuel for Abel's faith was his righteousness. What that means is that Abel wanted to be right with God. Abel had a desire to be right with God. And we pointed out when we looked at this, the difference between Cain and Abel. They both brought an offering, but we pointed out the fact that Cain was bringing an offering. It was just a religious thing to him. It was a religious activity. It was something to check off the list. He was supposed to bring an offering. He knew he was, so he just grabbed something. He just took it, and he just gave it to the Lord. But Abel's heart was truly a heart that sought to be right with God. It was more than just a religious experience. He was truly coming to make himself right with God. So for Abel, the fuel for his faith, the fuel that made his faith go and made his faith happen was his righteousness, the fact that he desired to be right with God. So we looked at Enoch. In verse 5 it says, Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death. He was not found because he had this testimony that he pleased God. And we looked at Enoch, and I think Enoch was in Genesis chapter 7. But it says here that he had the testimony that he pleased God. In Genesis it said that he walked with God. Here was the thing about Enoch. Enoch, what fueled Enoch's faith was his fellowship with God. He had a desire to be intimate with God and to be close to God. It was fellowship. He wanted to know God personally and intimately, and he wanted God to know him personally and intimately. He walked with God. He fellowshiped with God. And so that was also a fuel for his faith. And then we came to Noah. And you can go back to that other slide. There we go. So then we came back to Noah. And we talked about Noah. And he was in Genesis 6, 7. It said that he was divinely warned of things not yet seen, and he was moved with godly fear, it says there in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7. He was moved with godly fear and prepared an ark. The fuel for Noah's faith was his fear of the Lord. He understood who God was. He understood who God was, and he understood who he was. He had a healthy fear of the Lord. He understood that God was above all, and he understood that he was to live in submission to God, and he was to live surrendered to God, and he was to live under God. So that was the fuel for his faith, was his godly fear, his reverent fear of the Lord as he lived this life. So, and we're going to look at a couple of more of those today in the lives of Abraham and Sarah. So let me pick it up. Let me read before I forget to actually read. Let me read verses 8 through 12. It says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. And by faith he dwelt in the land of promise as a foreigner, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. And he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. By faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed. She bore a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars in the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. I'm going to stop right there just for a second. So we're going to look at Abraham, and I just need you to remember the story of Abraham. I just need you to remember that Abraham is the great patriarch. Abraham is the one that first received the promise from God. And Abraham, and look, I'm not going to make a big deal about this, but I want to point this out. Look, Abraham was a pagan when God spoke to his heart. He was a pagan. He was an idol worshiper. His family was an idol worshiper. And God spoke to his heart, and he said, you know what, Abram? He said, I want you to pack up your family, and I want you to take off, and you're going to go where I'm going to show you to go. He heard from God, and then he believed God. And you know what he did? He acted. He packed up his family, and he took off. And along the way, the promise began to get bigger. And the promise that God had for him, he began to reveal more to him. He said, you are going to be the descendants of a great nation. You are going to be the patriarch of a great nation. You're going to have a son. And from him is going to come this great nation. The people are going to be as many as the stars are in the sky, and the people are going to be as many as the sand is on the seashore. And he went through so many things, and we don't have time. And obviously, we talked about in Sunday school, our lesson today was about Abram being asked to sacrifice this only son, Isaac. Anyhow, I just want you to remember this whole story that God called him to go out. And, you know, here's one point I do want to make. It says, by faith, verse 8, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. Let me tell you something. Faith doesn't always give you all the answers. Amen. I need you to understand that. And Abraham is actually the prototype of faith. He's the prototype of what it means to live by faith. In the Old Testament, Paul uses him, James uses him, they all use him. He is the prototype of faith. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7 says this, that we walk by faith and not by sight. Is basically what that verse says. He is the prototype of how we hear from God and we simply obey even though we don't have all the answers. Abraham was told, he said, you're going to go to a place that I'm going to show you. And Abraham packed up and he took off, according to Hebrews, not knowing where he wants to go. Now, this is contrary to who we are as human beings, all right? And it's especially contrary to who we are as human beings in the culture that we live in. Because here's what, and especially, and I'm going to say especially our little corner of culture right here in Southeast Texas, and most of you have worked in or around, we want a process and a procedure for everything. We want it spelled out. This is the process, these are the procedures. You do step 1, and then you do step 2, and each process, each procedure tells you exactly how to do it. It tells you, you know, untwist the twist tie, open up the bag, reach in, grab a slice of bread, take it out. You know, I mean, we want spelled out, detail by detail, item by item, exactly what you do in order to receive the outcome that you're going to have. Let me tell you something. Faith isn't like that. I'm sorry. All right? And it's contrary to who you've been trained to be. I get it. I get it. Abraham had to pack the family up and take off and go, not even knowing where he was going. Sometimes you're not going to have all the answers. I can't even say sometimes. You're not going to have all the answers. God is going to speak to your heart. He's going to call your name. He's going to say, you know what, I got something for you to do. And it was as Abraham went, as he went on the journey, that the plan began to be unveiled before him. The plan began to be more clear. God began to give him more and more details about the plan. You see, you can't plan for living by faith. Did I even say that right? See, I didn't plan to say that. But you can't plan to live by faith. And what I mean is that a life of faith is not a life that you can plan out. Because a life of faith is you're going to have to take a step in the dark. You're going to have to head out in a direction that you don't know where you're going. You don't know how. Remember when we talked about Noah? And I still think about this, and I didn't emphasize it as much as I would if I was preaching it today. But God told him to build an ark, and he gave him all these dimensions in this great big giant boat. Yeah, what kind of tools did he have? I mean, think of what kind of tools he had to work with. And Noah's like, okay, okay. And God's going to ask you to do something. And you know what you're going to say? I don't have the tools to do that. I don't have what it takes to do that. I don't even know what an ark is. I don't even know what rain is. What do you mean you're asking me to do? I don't know what you're talking about, God. There's no process. God, you got to lay it out for me. God says, okay, I'll lay it out for you. Step 1, pack up your family and go. And you'll go to where I show you. And as you begin to walk in obedience and as you begin to walk in faith, God will begin to open up the plan for you. Faith says take a step, and you take it. It's been written on this. I have a whiteboard in my office. Every now and then I'll read something and I'll write on it. And the last thing I wrote this, I don't know how long ago. I haven't written anything on it in a long time. So what's on there now is what's been on there a long time. And it says, the best way to deal with God's will is to commit to doing it before you even know what it is. That's faith. Just say, I don't know what God's going to ask me to do, but whatever he's going to ask me to do, I'm committing now. I'm going to do it. So think about Sarah for a second. So Sarah, verse 11, it says, by faith Sarah also received strength to conceive seed. She bore a child when she was past age because she judged him faithful who had promised. So one of the things that's brought out in the story of Abraham and Sarah is that they were both beyond childbearing age. Chapter 16, verse 1 of Genesis says that Sarah had never had any children. She was barren. She had been barren all of her life. She had never had any children. Genesis 17:17 and also 18:12 both kind of say the same thing. When God first told Abraham in 17:17, look at that. It says Abraham fell on his face and he laughed. He laughed. He laughed at God. God said, your wife's going to have a kid. The old rolling on the floor laughing. He laughed at God. 18:12 says the same thing. Sarah heard God saying that to Abraham, and she laughed within herself, said, how am I going to have a baby right now? It was so ludicrous that when God first told it to them, they laughed in his face. They laughed at God. So here's Sarah. She's laughing at God. She's barren. She's never had a baby. She's even past the age of being able to have a baby. And so how in the world is she ever going to have a child? Faith is, God's like that. God likes to do the impossible. And he's going to ask you to take a step of faith in order to do that. But here's Sarah's fuel for faith. And so I'm going to look at Sarah and Abraham's fuel for faith. Here's Sarah's fuel for her faith. It's the very last sentence there in that verse. It says, she judged him faithful who had promised. The fuel for Sarah's faith was that she believed in the faithfulness of God. She believed that God was faithful. And she believed that whenever God gave a promise and whenever God gave a word, she just believed that he was going to do it. And I didn't give the guys this Isaiah 55:11. I didn't give them this one, so I don't know. We'll see how fast they are at getting there. But I just have a few verses here. Ooh. Ooh. They got there before I did. I actually just thought of this when we were worshiping a while ago. But this is what God said. He says, so shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish what I please, and it shall prosper in the thing for which I sent it. And so here's the deal. Sarah believed that. Now, that hadn't been written yet, but Sarah believed that. She believed that when God spoke his word, that it was going to come to pass, that it wasn't going to return unfulfilled, that it was going to do exactly what God wanted it to do. She believed in the faithfulness of God, and that was a fuel for her faith. So just a couple of other verses, 1 Corinthians chapter 1:9, and I think I even had these marked. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 9. I'm just going to use them because technology is a wonderful thing. It says, God is faithful by whom you were called into the fellowship of his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. It's just a statement of fact. Obviously, I'm honing in on that very first statement of fact that God is faithful. And God is faithful in all points. He is faithful in our salvation. He is faithful in the way that he works with us. He is faithful in all of his promises. He is faithful to his word. And our belief in God's faithfulness should fuel our faith. Give me that next one, 1 Corinthians. It was chapter 10. Verse what? Whatever I gave you was right. 10:13. No temptation has overtaken you except as is common to man, but God is faithful who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able. Let me ask you this. Do you believe that God is faithful? And do you believe that he is faithful to his word? And do you believe that he is faithful to this promise right here? All right? So why do we give in to temptation? Right? I mean, and I say we because I do too. But listen, we have a promise right here that God is faithful and he will never allow us to be tempted beyond a place where we are given it. We actually have the strength within us. That's his promise. That's his word. We actually have no excuse for our, and listen, I'm right there with you. I live right where you live, all right? When it comes to this thing, but I'm just telling you, we have no excuse for it, not if we truly believe in the faithfulness of God and in the faithfulness of his promise that he gives us right here, that he says he will always provide a way for us to escape from that temptation. What is it? 1 John 1:9, I think, is the next one that I put down. If we confess our sin, he is faithful and just to forgive us of our sin and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. So why are you walking around in guilt? I mean, if you believe in the promise of God, if you believe that God is faithful, if you believe that God is faithful to his word, this word says right here that when we confess that to him, that when we give that to him, that when we lay that on his cross, that he is faithful to forgive us of our sin. There is no reason for you to walk around beating yourself up, whipping yourself on the back, or slapping yourself in the face over the failures that you've had. There is no reason, and it's not because you're going to be such a great person. It is because God is faithful to forgive you. He is faithful and just to forgive us of our sin and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Let's just do a couple more. 1 Thessalonians 5:24. It's just reiteration. He who calls you is faithful, and he will also do it. It's just saying that God is faithful. He's faithful to his word. He's faithful to his call. He's faithful to what he wants you to do. When God calls you to take a step, he is faithful to supply for you whatever you need in order to take that step. Hebrews 10, verse 23, he says, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, because he who promised is faithful. Once again, look, this is real easy. All you got to do is go home, get on your little Bible app or your Bible program, and all you got to do is type in faithful or God is faithful or whatever, and you are going to get all kinds of verses that proclaim that God is faithful. What was the fuel for Sarah's faith? What took her to a place to where, when, as a barren woman, past childbearing years, that she could actually produce a son? What fueled her faith in being able to do that? Her belief that God was faithful, and that because he promised it and because he said it was going to happen, that it was going to happen. It was as good as carved in stone. You could take it to the bank, and she started living on it. She heard from God, she believed God, and she started acting like she believed God. And that's what true faith really is. God keeps his word. So here's what I'm asking you. Do you believe in God's faithfulness? Now listen, again, what you do says more about what you believe than what you say. It's not, do I believe in God's faithfulness? Yes, absolutely, amen, amen. Do I live like I believe in God's faithfulness? That's the question. Do I live like I believe in the faithfulness of God? And it is that will be fuel for my faith. It is that will make my faith stronger and give me a greater faith. So Abraham, and I want to point this out about Abraham. I still got time. I must be talking fast. I hope you can understand me. I'm talking stuff. Let me read the rest of. Let me read verses 13 through 16 that I hadn't read yet. And then I want to talk about what was fuel for Abraham's faith. First of all, look at this. Look at verse 13. This is interesting. It says that these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but they saw them far off, and they were assured of them, and they embraced them, and they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But now they desire something better. That is a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So I almost feel like you got to kind of follow with me just a little bit here. But here, I want you to keep this in mind. So God told Abraham to go to the place where I'm going to take you. So where's the promised land? Just those of you who've been in church all your life. Where's the promised land? Well, Canaan. Biblically, it was the land of Canaan. The land of Canaan was the promised land. So does anybody know, did Abraham ever make it to Canaan? Now this is a trick question. It's a trick. I'm telling you, it's a trick question. He absolutely made it to Canaan. Not only did he make it to Canaan, he lived there. He lived in Canaan. Now, here's the reason, and I really am trying to point this out. Here's the thing that I'm trying to point out. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all three of them lived in Canaan. They all made it to the land of Canaan. They all lived in the land of Canaan. But here's the deal. They didn't possess it. They didn't possess it. In fact, these verses says that they lived there like they were foreigners. They lived there like, listen to some of these verses. I'm going to start in verse 10. 10, for he waited for the city whose foundations and whose builder and maker is God. Verse 13, verse 14, verse 16, they desire better, that is a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Verse 9, by faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. So they dwelt in the land, but they never really possessed the land. And yet they were able to continue to have faith and believe by faith that God was actually going to give them that land in the sense that they was going to be possessed. But here's the interesting thing to me that I'm seeing is the fuel for Abraham's faith. Abraham looked for something that was beyond this world. It said that he waited for a city whose builder and maker was God. He was waiting for a place that was heavenly. Verse 14 says that he was seeking a homeland. And verse 15 says, if he was really just seeking a homeland as far as a physical place in this world, verse 15 says he could have turned around and gone back anytime he wanted to. He could have turned around and went back. He says, but no, in verse 16, but they desire something better. They desire something that is heavenly, a heavenly country. And therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Listen, Abraham had a way. Abraham had his heart and he had his mind set on heavenly things and set on godly things. Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. The fuel for his faith was this. If then you were raised with Christ, then seek those things which are above, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on the things of the earth. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ with God. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. If you want to have some real fuel for your faith, we've got to stop living for this world and start living for the next world. We want to have real fuel for our faith. We've got to stop desiring things that are going to burn with a fervent heat, as Peter talks about, and start having faith for things that are going to last and be eternal and be forever. There's a fuel for our faith. I'm fixing to say something here that's going to convict us, and well, maybe it will, maybe it won't. Some of us, some of you, I did say us the first time. Some people have prayed more fervently for their kid to get a hit in a peewee baseball game than they've prayed for the salvation of that child's soul. Now you tell me I'm wrong. And you tell me which one really matters. You tell me, you think about all the things that you want to believe for and all the things that you want to have faith for, and then you line them up in this one thing. When it all comes and Christ comes again, and didn't we preach about this a few weeks ago from 1 Peter and talked about the fervent heat and everything was going to melt? Then I need to. If I haven't, I need to. Everything was going to melt. Everything was going to melt with a fervent heat. You take these things that you're believing for, these things that you're having faith for, and you put them in one of two categories. Are they just simply earthly, or are they eternal? Are they something that's going to burn and be melted with fervent heat, or are they going to last forever and exist forever in eternity with God? We believe more and we become stronger. I say we become stronger. We put more strength into faith for a job or for a home or for a truck or for whatever, for whatever earthly things that we want. Things that are going to burn should Christ show up this afternoon. Things that will not matter in eternity. It's time that we placed our faith faith up in heaven. It's time that we placed our faith where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. If we are going to be a true people, fueled by faith, an army of people of faith, which I've asked you to join me in praying for, if we are going to be that people of faith right here in our community, we are going to have to place our faith high above the things of this world. We are going to have to be fueled by having things that transcend this life, transcend this earth, transcend this world, and the things of this world. We're going to have to put our hearts, we're going to have to put our faith, our hearts, we're going to have to put our faith in heaven with God where Christ is. It's time we fueled our faith. We heard from God, we believed what he said, and we acted on it, and we're able to act on it because like Sarah, we believe he's faithful, and because like Abraham, we're looking for something beyond this world. Stand up with me if you would.